All right, and there's the ding dong that says we are recording. Okay, so we were talking about the framework, about the distinction between protostomes and deuterostomes. There's lots more about this in Biology 4401. And deuterostomes don't have many parasites. We talked about lampreys and things. Protostomes include lophophorates, which aren't parasitic. Platyzoa, the big ones there are, of course, platy some to tail. Okay, sorry, I just heard somebody go ding dong. Here we go. Okay, there's somebody with the ding dong. No, what I mean is somebody has just joined us. And right, I'll go back to the slides. There. Ecdysozoa will occupy us for much, and arthropods include an awful lot of very important parasites. Trochozoa don't have very many. We talked about a few parasitic mollusks on Wednesday, notably the freshwater mussels with parasitic Glochidia larvae. And the other major group of trochozoa is the segmented worms, aka the annelids, which include a few minor parasites, but also include the leeches. Pretty good sized group of ectoparasites slash micropredators. And again, you've seen this before. What unites the trochozoa is an ancestor had a larva like this. This larva looked like two cones stuck together, broad end to broad end, with double bands of cilia and tufts at both poles. Leeches don't have this anymore, and neither do earthworms. Earthworms, because they've adapted to a terrestrial life cycle where having a larva that can swim in the open ocean is not really useful if you live in soil. Leeches have also adopted different embryological development. They don't go through trochophores, but their relatives do, and their common ancestor probably did. So do most mollusks, although again with some variation on that theme in critters like squid. So not everybody has this stage, but we think it was present in the common ancestor. Trochozoans, by the way, also share some a lot of features in DNA sequences and things like that. Okay, so phylum Annelida, pretty big one. They're called segmented worms because the coelom, remember that open body cavity that the guts are hanging out in, is partitioned into segments like the bulkheads in a ship. If anybody's ever dissected an earthworm, you've seen this. The practical upshot of this is that, if anybody's ever gone fishing, you've probably put an earthworm on a hook. If an earthworm had one continuous body cavity, then when you stabbed it with a hook, the whole thing would deflate. But the fact that the body's divided into segments with these sheets of tissue means that you can stab it with the hook and most of the body is not directly affected. Most of the body is still mobile, even though you lose coelomic pressure in that one segment where the hook goes in. Okay, sorry if that was a little less than pleasant, but that's the best way I think I can describe it. There are some species that lose the segmentation and then leeches get kind of weird, but by and large, this works. There's a mostly marine grouping of annelids called the Polychaeta. Chaeta means a bristle, and poly means many. They've got generally bristly bodies with paddle-like appendages called parapodia. In some, those can be reduced, but in many, you see them quite clearly. Most of these are marine, except for a couple of weird freshwater forms that have lost most of the obvious features that would place them in the Polychaeta. The other group, Clitolata, doesn't have many bristles, maybe just a few, possibly none. There aren't any parapodia, none of these paddles. And there's a specialized section of the body that secretes the egg sacs into which eggs are laid. It's called the clitellum. You've seen this if you've ever looked at an earthworm. Just back of the head, there's a kind of swollen section, maybe just a few segments long, lighter in color. That's the clitellum. And we divide Clitolata into oligochaetes, which is earthworms and their kin, and Hierudinia, which is leeches. So a typical polychaete looks like this. This is a strictly marine form. Nereus viridis, the green clamworm. You're not likely to have seen it unless you've spent a lot of time at the ocean. Critters like this get sold for, I think they sell them for fish bait in some coastal towns. I think they used to sell them at the fishing docks in San Francisco Bay. You could bait your hook with green clamworms. What you need to see is the body's divided into a whole bunch of segments. This thing looks kind of like a centipede, although it's not very closely related. And every segment bears a flap. These are little flaps or little paddles. That's the parapodia. And each parapod has two bundles of setae. Look like little, I guess, stiff bristled brushes sticking out of the parapod. These can be used for swimming. They can be used for burrowing. In the case of a species that I remember finding down on the Gulf of California one year, they can be used for defense. There's a species, genus Hermodice, where the setae are very sharp. They come out easily like porcupine quills, and they have a little venom on them that burns your skin. There's a reason why Hermodice is known as the fireworm. And I found this out, exactly why it's called the fireworm. Anyway, so that's a typical polychaete. Vast majority of them are free living. Some of them wander around. Others live in permanent tubes. And I just remembered, if you go down to an aquarium store with a good marine department, Pet Country in Conway is pretty good. Petco also has one, although I think Pet Country's better. Sometimes they have in stock what is often called Christmas tree worms. There's this tube, and periodically these long, very highly branched, feathery-looking structures will protrude out of the tube. It's sometimes called feather duster worm or Christmas tree worm. Those are polychaetes that are sedentary, live in tubes all of the time, and stick out modified appendages to feed, but don't normally leave their tube. In fact, if you take them out, I think it kills them. So you can see some of these in town. Some of them move around. Others, like the feather duster worm, just sit there and filter feed. And there's a few that have turned to a life of crime and gone parasitic. This is one of those sedentary worms called Terebolides californica. Inside its body cavity is a parasitic polychaete called Labrorostratus zaragozensis. So there's a few that are parasitic, not very many. There's another one. This is a polychaete in genus Spinther that includes 7 species that are ectoparasites on sponges because somebody's got to. And then there's one small group that lives as ectoparasites on sea lilies. Sea lilies, aka crinoids, used to be a heck of a lot more common and diverse, but they took it on the chin in a mass extinction 240 some million years ago, and have never really recovered their former diversity. The body is superficially like a starfish, but in life position, they're upside down. The mouth is at the top. In stalked sea lilies, there's a stalk growing out of the end opposite the mouth. So they'll sit there with their mouths facing up and their numerous branched arms sticking out, filter feeding. The ones that some still have stalks, the others have lost their stalk, but they've got feelers on the side of the body away from the mouth that enable them to creep or sometimes even to swim. Anyway, no more about those. There's a small group that live as external parasites on sea lilies. You're looking at the body of one. You can see the arms arising from it. There's a mouth at the center, and that brownish thing at about the on the oral disc at about your 2 o'clock position is one of these ectoparasites called a mesostomarian. And there's a couple under scanning electron microscopy. They're so highly modified for a parasitic lifestyle that some have placed them in a separate phylum, proposing that they don't actually belong in the annelids at all. You can see the parapods, if that's what they are, have gotten thick and stumpy and now have claws at the tips for hanging onto the crinoid. Not a lot is known about these guys. Okay. Oligochaeta, that's earthworms in kin. They've got that clitellum for secreting mucus, which hardens into egg cases. Also albumin, the protein that the developing embryos will feed on. Very few bristles, maybe just a couple per segment. You can feel them if you've ever petted an earthworm with your finger, but there's not very many of them at all. No need to worry about how they're classified. Roughly, we can talk about dividing them into large burrowing forms like earthworms. Technically, those are called megadryals. And then small, mostly aquatic forms are called microdryals. Most of them eat organic detritus, and there's 3,500 species of them. I assume everybody's seen earthworms. Those are familiar megadryals. Microdryals are pretty common in fresh water. I see them every time I look at pond water, most of the times. They tend to be quite a bit smaller. This is one that you might see probably less than a millimeter wide. This one's called tubifex. They tend to live in, well, they live in fresh water, and they tend to like very organic, rich habitats. So they tend to like hanging out in places like where treated sewage is getting dumped back into a river. They'll often be a nice tubifex colony. They'll burrow with their heads into organic, rich, nice stinky black mud, but wave their tails above in order to keep part of their body exposed to oxygenated water. And they tend to live in big clumps. And I think I picked tubifex because occasionally I get a student who's into keeping freshwater aquariums. And at least when I did it when I was a kid, you could buy freeze-dried tubifex worms to feed your fish. Actually, they used to recommend people ought to try to catch live tubifex to feed their aquarium fish, but I never did that. So yeah, those are little microdryals. There are lots others. If you really want to know, you can take invert zoo if I'm ever allowed to teach that again. I probably will be. There's one weirdo that's a parasite of snails, Chaetognaster limnaei. That's a microdryal that's turned parasitic. You can see a few of the bristles up towards the head end. Some of them are ectocommensals, meaning they live on the outside of the body and don't do any particular harm to the snail. Others are endoparasites living inside the snail kidneys. The weird thing is that if you're a snail and you have these in your kidneys, you gain some immunity to infection by flukes, which is weird. I'm not entirely sure how that works, but having one parasite can apparently block infection by another parasite. Given that some flukes are serious health problems for humans, like schistosoma, the bladder fluke, it strikes me that it might be interesting to figure out how Chaetognaster does this, or I don't know, maybe even breed a whole bunch of Chaetognaster and infect all the snails in a schistosoma environment, because that might help you break the life cycle of the fluke that you don't want. You could maybe break the life cycle of schistosoma if you either infected the snails with Chaetognaster, or maybe just figured out what Chaetognaster was doing and figured out a way to do it artificially. So weird, but might conceivably be beneficial. Small group called the Branchiobdelids that you'll occasionally see in around Arkansas, I guess in Conway, but in Arkansas fresh waters. Branchiobdelids are obligate symbionts with crustaceans, usually on freshwater crawfish. Some of them they can be commensal, they can even be mutualistic, because as they crawl over the crawfish exoskeleton, they'll clean it. But they can turn parasitic because they'll eat the crawfish tissues if the exoskeleton gets a wound, gets broken, and soft tissue comes out. I won't say much more about these guys. They don't have chaetae. They've got a jawed mouth, kind of like leeches, but there's other features that place them closer to oligochaetes. So whether they belong in the leeches or not, kind of a judgment call there. That's what some of them look like. Xerinageton victoriensis, 11 segments visible on the outside. And that's a bunch of them living on a crawfish claw. Different species might be found on the claws, on the legs, or even inside the gill chamber. Okay, so pretty obscure groups that we've talked about so far. True leeches in the Hyrodinia, they've got exactly 32 segments. The last 7 segments make a posterior sucker, and there's almost always an anterior sucker as well. And this sets up leeches' ability to move. It's called bedelloid, which means like a leech, locomotion, aka looping, and it's similar to what inchworm caterpillars do. You stick the posterior down and put the anterior out. So you stick your butt down, push your head out, and then use the anterior sucker to latch on with your head and pull in the posterior. So you protrude the head and then pull your behind after it and keep repeating, setting up this looping or inchworming bedelloid style of locomotion. One species has chaetae, but all of the rest have completely lost theirs. Leeches are not bristly at all. With a few exceptions, there's no appendages, there's no gills or anything like that. There's nothing that looks like parapodia. And the coelom has been reduced to a system of canals, and the body's mostly solid. So you no longer have that big, sloshy, fluid-filled cavity inside a leech body. About a quarter of all species are actually free-living. Vicki McDonald this summer apparently spotted an enormous leech on one of her runs. And it was probably, I didn't see it. She asked me what it might be. But Arkansas actually has a couple of giant leech species that when they're relaxed are 10 centimeters long. That's about 5.5 inches. Maybe a little, maybe not, okay, roughly 5 inches, close enough. And they can stretch out to get even longer than that. So we've actually got giant leeches in Arkansas, but our species of big leeches are actually predatory. They're not blood-sucking. So you do not have to worry about being attacked by Hemopus marmorata the next time you set foot outdoors. One group of leeches has a muscular proboscis but doesn't have any jaws. The blood-feeding leeches in the Aryncobdelida may or may not have toothed jaws, and the bloodsuckers use those toothed jaws to cut holes in their prey and slurp out blood and body fluids. So there's the anatomy of one of them. The digestive tract is in orange, and there's a lot of blind pouches. That increases the capacity of the digestive tract because leeches will feed, and blood-sucking leeches will take in quite a lot of blood, swell up a great deal, and it may be weeks before they need to feed again. So the gut's in orange. The male and female reproductive organs are in blue and pink. Like earthworms, leeches are hermaphrodites, and they can't self-fertilize, but they'll pair up and each will fertilize the other. And many species prey on smaller invertebrates, and this is one of the giant ones, Hemopus sanguisuga. It's got an awesome name. It translates as the bloody-faced bloodsucker. It sounds like it could be a good name for a band, but it's actually a predator. It's called the horse leech, but it does not actually prey on horses. It'll feed on earthworms and on any smallish invertebrate that it can catch. So it looks scary, but it's harmless. The one that Dr. McDonald saw that we get in Arkansas is probably in the same genus. There's one called Hemopus marmorata, which looks like this, but it's kind of a black and gray, marbled, or kind of maybe pepper and salt sort of pattern. Slightly different color pattern, but the same basic body shape. So yes, if you encounter giant leeches, you don't need to worry. The European leech, Hirudo medicinalis, and our species in North America actually do bite. Not all blood-feeding species feed off of open wounds. Many of them can't bite, but Hirudo has 3 very sharp jaws, and it will latch on, use those jaws to open up a wound, and then inject an anticoagulant into the wound to keep the blood flowing, a protein called hirundin. So there you've got a lovely illustration by Edward Gorey showing a innocent child about to be sucked dry by a leech. This is from a book that he wrote called The Gashly Crumb Tinies, which is really kind of macabre. Anyway, so on the left, you can see what it looks like inside a medicinal leech's mouth. They're labeled K, but you can see those 3 very sharp sawtooth jaws in the mouth. And on the right, that's a wound from a leech. And if you can see, it looks kind of like a letter Y. Leech bites usually have a triradiate shape, looking like a letter Y, with made of 3 cuts about 120 degrees apart. And back in the medieval ages and into modern history, medical theory at the time, going back to the ancient Greeks, held that if you got sick, it was an imbalance in your bodily humors. Humors were the basic body fluids There was blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And if you had too much of one or the other, or not enough of one or the other, it could make you ill. So the aim of medical treatment was to restore the balance in your bodily humors, your bodily fluids. So if you had an excess of, black bile, you could get rid of the excess by taking a purge, meaning something to give you serious diarrhea. If you had an excess of blood, you could remove the excess. Some doctors would use a specialized knife for bleeding you. You might know that George Washington got a very bad sore throat, but what probably killed him was his doctors bleeding him. Okay, well, we've taken a pint of his blood. Doesn't seem to be working. Better try it again. Yeah, that pretty much ended his life. But if you only needed a little bit of blood extracted, you could use a leech. And here's a leech jar. Every doctor used to have some of these with fresh spring water and fresh leeches. And the lady is demonstrating how you put leeches on your arm to remove just a bit of excess blood. Incidentally, the word leech used to be the standard word for doctor. In some very old texts, you see the word leech being applied to doctors, but the word has now almost completely lost its association and just come to mean the worm. So yeah, there she's putting doctors on her arm. And the medicinal leech was collected in Britain by professional leech collectors. Here you have a few plying their trade. It was the kind of thing that poor people could do, physically handicapped people could do, elderly people could do, because to collect leeches, all you really needed to do was stand in a nice marshy body of water and wait for the leeches to latch onto you, and then peel them off and put them in your collecting bucket. So it was the kind of thing that you could earn a little money with a minimum of physical labor. So even if you were, paralyzed or something like that, you could try to support yourself as a leech collector. And it was collected in such numbers that the species has not quite recovered. It's still classified as near threatened. The fact that a lot of the marshes where they used to live have been drained doesn't help either. And I'm a sucker for biological poetry. The English Romantic poet William Wordsworth wrote this long autobiographical poem, and there's a little bit in it where he meets an elderly leech collector who says, "Once I could meet with them on every side, but they have dwindled long by slow decay, yet still I persevere and find them where I may." So, yes, not very many cases of leech collectors in English literature. See, it's not just a biology class. It's all connected. All knowledge is one. Right. The next slide's a little bit gross, because leeches have come back into use. They were actually approved by the FDA in 2004 for medical use again, and they're used in reattachment surgery. Somebody's ear got torn off, and at the upper left, you can see the reattached ear, and you'll notice that it's turning a, rather ugly looking purple shade. When you reattach a body part, you can hook up the skin, the muscles, the bones, if there are any, and maybe the major blood vessels. But there's no possible way you can hook up all of the capillaries. And the risk when you do a reattachment is that because you haven't been able to fully restore circulation, blood is going to pool in the reattached structure, the ear in this case, and build up, not be able to get out, end up clotting, and maybe cause the loss of the reattached part. You can't keep that ear on if you don't restore the blood supply quickly. So there at the lower left, a couple of leeches have been added. They're sucking out the pooled blood, and because they're injecting anticoagulant, they're keeping the circulation in the ear from clotting. And so at 48 hours, you can see there's 3 leeches on that ear. At 72 hours, there's 1 leech still on that ear, and you can see the ear now looks normal, right? The skin tone is right where it ought to be. The ear looks generally healthy, and the ear is probably going to stay on. So leeches are actually still used. They were reapproved in 2004 for medical use. Last I looked, they were trying to find alternatives because leeches, have been over-collected. It's a hassle to use them because once they feed, you can't reuse them for weeks. So you've got to have a large supply of leeches on hand because you can't keep reusing them, not very frequently. And there's also a concern that leeches could spread bacteria. You can't really keep them in perfectly sterile conditions. They were looking at trying to synthesize the anticoagulant that leeches use and be able to use that medicinally without having to stick an actual leech on. So I don't know how widely they're still used, but there was at least a time when they were. So there. Last thing I'll say about leeches is they're used a great deal in neurobiology research. You're looking at a leech that's been stained, kind of looks like a plaid. Muscle fibers are in red, and then green and blue shows you the nervous system. Every segment of a leech contains a pair of ganglia with between 300 and 400 relatively large neurons. You can inject fluorescent dye into each neuron and map where it goes. So you can map the nervous system quite well, and the basic circuitry of simple behaviors like flexing or turning has actually been worked out. Leeches have this simple nervous system with big nerve cells that are much more easily mapped and much more accessible than, let's say, human brain cells. So a lot of very basic neurobiology has been done on leeches. And if any of you go into neuroscience, you might encounter this research. Okay, that's what I've got for you today. That's all I'm going to say about leeches. And on Monday, we start we'll start covering the phylum Nematoda, which is one of the big ones as far as parasites go. There's lots of nematode parasites in humans and in domestic animals as well as wild ones. And yeah, we'll go next week, we'll go hunting roundworms at the supermarket. And so I will stop recording now.